There is a day that few speak of, but many have felt its weight. A day when the sky nearly turned to fire, when decisions made in silence could have swallowed nations in flame. This is not the story of weapons. It is not the story of politics. It is a story of the mind and what it means to stand on the edge. The moment came quietly. No trumpet, no roar. Only signals passed. Orders whispered. Fears whispered. Fears whispered. Fears whispered. Fears whispered. Fears whispered. Fears whispered. And when it came, it took full advance. A moment when folks could lose. Time calls. It took full advance. A moment when folks could lose. Time calls. They had stood like warriors locked in meditation. Eyes closed, breath calm, but tension coiled beneath the skin. Then, one movement, one provocation, and the world shifted. In that hour, calculations were made not with hearts, but with egos. The power to destroy was ready, but the power to see clearly, that was what truly saved the moment. Because destruction is not a shout, it is a breath held too long, a silence that festers, for the promise, supposedly held too long, a silence that festers. And on that day, it nearly overtook both. But discipline saved it. Not missiles, not machines. Discipline in leaders, in soldiers, in unseen monks of strategy who chose stillness over chaos. Each moment of hesitation was a blade that cut away disaster. Each second of restraint was a mountain that stood between action and ruin. The truth is, when nations fight, they believe the enemy is across the board, but the real enemy lies in the untrained mind, impatient, angry, blind. That day, both sides faced not each other, but themselves. They looked into the mirror of history and saw not glory, but smoke and ashes waiting. Power without purpose is like a sword in the hand of a child. But when power is guided by understanding, it becomes protection, not destruction. That day, the edge was sharp, but wisdom kept both feet from slipping. And so the story is untold, because nothing exploded, no flags were torn, no cities fell, yet it was a war all the same, a war within. The greatest victories are not the ones that end in applause or headlines. They are the ones that leave nothing behind. No ruins, no graves, no regret. Only silence and the chance to begin again. Conflict is born not from power, but from misunderstanding. At first glance, conflict seems to arise from the imbalance of strength. One side has more, the other has less, and so the stronger dominates. But history, when viewed with clarity and patience, reveals something more subtle. The true origin of conflict lies not in weapons or armies, but in the minds of those who wield them. Misunderstanding is the seed, fear is the water, ego is the sun that makes that seed grow into a forest of fire. On the day Pakistan nearly destroyed India, it was not because one nation was stronger than the other. It was because both sides believed they understood the other, when in truth they did not even understand themselves. When a mind is unclear, it reacts. It interprets uncertainty as threat. A silence becomes an insult. A movement becomes a challenge. A precaution becomes aggression. Aggression becomes aggression. Aggression becomes aggression. Aggression becomes aggression. This is the root of all miscommunication that escalates into war. In the military rooms of both nations, maps were drawn, codes were read, and assumptions were made. These assumptions were based on fear, on past wounds, on historical grievances, and on the inability to see beyond one's own position. Fear does not lead to wisdom, it leads to reaction. And reaction, if not caught in time, becomes destruction. At the core of every military confrontation is the failure to pause, a failure to breathe, a failure to listen not only to the other, but to oneself. Both India and Pakistan have long shared not just a border, but a history, complex, painful, and deeply interwoven. This shared history carries with it pride, trauma, memories of partition, and years of mistrust. Yet those who lead today are often trapped in the images of yesterday. When people look at each other not as they are, but as symbols of what has been, they stop seeing reality. They see ghosts. And ghosts cannot be reasoned with. Misunderstanding begins the moment we stop listening with clarity and start listening with memory. On that day, both nations stood close to a line not marked on any map, but drawn in the sand of consciousness, a line that once crossed would lead not just to war, but to devastation. To misunderstand is not merely to hear wrong, it is to see through a fog created by ego. When leaders think that strength is shown in how quickly they act, rather than how wisely they reflect, then the nation walks toward fire, thinking it is light. Pakistan, on that day, believed it needed to strike to protect its dignity. India believed it needed to prepare to defend its honor. But dignity and honor are not things that can be defended with missiles. They are internal states. They are not proven by aggression, but by restraint. And this is where the misunderstanding lies, thinking that survival means shouting louder, moving faster, hitting harder. In truth, survival in the modern age means choosing not to strike, even when you can. That is the power that changes history. The mind that misunderstands is always busy. It is restless. It feeds on assumptions. In the military bunkers, in the command rooms, men sat with hands hovering over buttons, with eyes glued to screens, but even more dangerous than the weapons they monitored were the thoughts running through their minds. If we wait, we lose. If we don't act now, they will. These are the whispers of misunderstanding. These are the seeds of war. In the absence of inner stillness, these thoughts feel like truth, but they are only shadows. Only discipline of mind can see through them. It was not the number of weapons or the sophistication of radar systems that brought India and Pakistan to the brink. It was the inability to step beyond reactive thinking, a misunderstanding of the other's silence, a misreading of the other's intent, a misplacement of pride. Each act, each countermove fed the illusion that war was the only path forward. In truth, there were countless doors out of the room, but a misunderstanding blinds us from all exits. The fog of the ego says, there is no other way. But there is always another way. If one knows how to look, many soldiers are trained to fight, but not trained to understand. They are taught to strike, but not to question. And so the misunderstanding is multiplied generation after generation. This is why history repeats. Not because the facts repeat, but because the minds remain the same. Until we train the mind like we train the body, disciplined, focused, aware, we will always mistake shadows for enemies and silence for war. Yeah. And silence that day, India and Pakistan nearly burned. Not because they hated each other, but because they could not see each other. They saw only their own fear reflected back. Misunderstanding is not only dangerous, it is contagious. One soldier panics and 10 respond. One leader suspects and a whole cabinet prepares for battle. The chain of reaction is quick, and in the nuclear age, even a few minutes of misjudgment can rewrite the fate of millions. This is why understanding must be cultivated like a practice, not just in monasteries, but in government, in defense, in every person who holds power. Understanding is the highest form of strength. It is harder to maintain calm than to launch an attack. It requires more courage to wait than to fire. So the day Pakistan nearly destroyed India was not a tale of strength meeting strength. It was a tale of blindness almost becoming death, of misunderstanding nearly becoming legacy. And in the quiet that followed, those who reflected knew we were not saved by weapons. We were saved by this small number of minds that refused to panic, that chose to see instead of assume, that dared to hold silence when the world screamed for action. Such minds are rare, but they are the ones who prevent history from becoming tragedy. Misunderstanding breeds when the mind is not trained. It thrives in those who speak more than they listen, who react more than they observe, who judge more than they reflect. This is why peace is not a treaty, it is a discipline. It is not signed, it is practiced. And the practice begins not on a battlefield, but within the self. When each of us trains our own mind to see clearly, we contribute to a world that sees clearly. When leaders are chosen not for their aggression but their insight, misunderstanding loses its grip. The story of that day may remain untold in official reports, but it echoes in the silence that followed. A silence paid for not with bombs, but with restraint. With those who remembered that to misunderstand the other is to destroy yourself. Destruction is only avoided through discipline and awareness, not because destruction is an external force that can be held back by mere walls, weapons, or borders, but because it is an internal possibility that arises from within every mind, every institution, every decision. The potential to destroy exists not only in the machinery of war, but in the undisciplined thoughts that give birth to fear, reaction. On the day when the tension between Pakistan and India reached its breaking point, it was not the power of weapons that kept them from collapsing into irreversible conflict. It was the fragile presence of a few individuals, a few decisions, a few breaths of awareness that prevented the final step. Destruction stood close, like a shadow behind every command. But discipline kept it from overtaking the light. In times of crisis, it is easy to fall into reaction. The mind desires to act quickly. It becomes convinced that stillness is weakness, that waiting is surrender. But this is illusion. True discipline is the ability to remain still when everything around you calls for movement. In the military corridors of both nations, alarms were ready Jets were fueled, nuclear payloads prepared with quiet efficiency. And yet, not everything that is ready must be used. Readiness is not the same as recklessness. Discipline is the invisible shield that allows the hand to remain steady while others tremble. Awareness is more than knowing what the other side is doing. It is knowing what your own mind is doing. It is observing not only the movement of troops or the escalation of threats, but also observing the movement of emotion within. What is the nature of fear? Where does anger begin? These questions are not spiritual luxuries, they are survival necessities. Without this kind of awareness, leaders become slaves to their own impulses. They do not command the situation, they are commanded by it. And when those who hold power lose mastery over themselves, they lose control over the outcome. Discipline is forged long before it is needed. It is built in moments of peace, in training, in quiet decisions that seem small but form the foundation of wisdom. The officer who trains his mind to pause before reacting. The advisor who cultivates calm in his speech. The leader who practices restraint even in daily matters. These are the ones who, when crisis comes, do not crumble. They do not seek to destroy because they have nothing to prove. They do not act from panic because they have met their panic before and understood its voice. The greatest generals are not those who conquer, but those who prevent the need to conquer. The most powerful nations are not those who threaten war, but those who have the strength to avoid it without appearing weak. On the day that destruction nearly consumed both India and Pakistan, it was not prevented by luck. It was prevented by the presence of those who were trained to see beyond their own fear, who recognized the moment for what it was, not just a political conflict, but a test of human mastery. If a single decision had tilted the wrong way, the skies would have turned black and the rivers would have carried ash. But awareness stepped in, not dramatically, not with speeches or proclamations, but in the quiet choice not to strike first. That choice was invisible to the world, but it saved the world. There are always voices that scream for action. They say we must respond. We cannot look weak. This is our chance. But these voices are often not coming from a place of clarity. They come from fear masquerading as courage. They come from ego demanding recognition. Awareness is what allows us to hear those voices and not obey them. To recognize that not every emotion must lead to action, not every threat must lead to retaliation. Discipline is what allows a person to hold the sword and choose not to swing it. In the ancient traditions of warriors, there was a saying, the true warrior is the one who has mastered himself. This mastery is not theatrical, it is not angry, it does not need to display dominance, it is silent, focused. This is the type of discipline that avoided destruction on that day between the two nations. Not a discipline born of fear, but of understanding. Understanding that the real war is not between countries. It is between clarity and chaos, between stillness and reaction, between mastery and ego. Modern warfare is not only fought with missiles and tanks, it is fought with perception, with misinformation, with digital shadows, and yet the internal battlefield remains the same. Can the mind remain clear while surrounded by pressure? Can the leader hold his breath for one moment longer and ask, what is the true cost of this action? Discipline answers those questions with silence first, then response. Awareness answers those questions with observation, then insight. Together, they form the only true defense against destruction. A nuclear weapon can destroy a city, but a careless thought can destroy the world. In the chain of command, it takes one misunderstanding, one unchecked assumption, one reaction based on ego to set the fire. And this is why awareness is not just necessary, it is sacred. It is the candle in the storm. Without it, power becomes poison. Without it, loyalty becomes fanaticism. But with awareness, even the most dangerous situation can be navigated with grace. On that day, it was not the size of armies or the sharpness of missiles that prevented war. It was the discipline of waiting, the discipline of reflection, the discipline of choosing one more minute of silence over one instant of fire. And that silence saved millions. Not all stories are told with sound. Some are written in what didn't happen, what was held back, what was endured and transcended. Destruction is always possible, but so is restraint. It is not a matter of chance, it is a matter of training. And training begins in every individual who wishes to live with integrity, whether a soldier or a civilian. When enough minds are trained to respond with discipline and awareness, then even the gravest danger can be transformed into a moment of realization, a step back from the edge, a breath where there could have been a blast. That day was not a day of victory or defeat, it was a day of testing. A test not of technology, but of maturity, not of strategy, but of presence. The ones who passed that test may never be named, their work may never be known, but their silence echoed louder than any explosion, and their calmness became the wall that stopped destruction in its tracks. In the end, it is not what we do when we are ready to act that defines us. It is what we do when we are ready to explode and choose not to. That is the mark of a disciplined mind. That is the essence of true awareness. And that is how destruction, no matter how close, can be avoided, not with more power, but with deeper presence. Strength without wisdom invites collapse from within. When a person, a leader or a nation gathers strength, it is often seen as a sign of power, of progress, of security. But strength alone is not a guarantee of survival, nor a promise of peace. In fact, when strength is not balanced by inner clarity, it becomes a weight too heavy to carry, and the very force that was meant to protect becomes the beginning of downfall. On the day that Pakistan nearly destroyed India, both nations stood with immense power at their disposal. But what prevented collapse was not more strength, it was wisdom. The wisdom to restrain, the wisdom to wait, the wisdom to see beyond pride and to understand the true nature of consequences. A country may build the most advanced weapons, train its forces to perfection, and prepare for every scenario, but if the minds behind those systems are clouded by ego, fear, or revenge, then the strength they control becomes a danger not only to the enemy, but to themselves. True strength is not in how loudly one can roar, but in how deeply one can see. In times of crisis, this distinction becomes critical, because when the mind is unclear, every act of strength becomes a potential misstep, a weapon pointed in the wrong direction, a command given out of impulse, a threat made without understanding its echo. Collapse from within begins subtly. It starts when decisions are no longer made from a place of balance, but from a place of competition. When the goal becomes to prove who is stronger, rather than who is wiser. On the surface, such behavior may appear bold, even heroic. But underneath, it is hollow. It feeds on temporary victories and ignores the long-term cost. In both Pakistan and India, there are leaders, soldiers, and citizens who have witnessed the danger of this imbalance. They know that one misjudged display of strength can provoke a reaction that cannot be undone. They understand that the illusion of control fades quickly once the storm begins. The internal collapse of a nation does not always begin with protest, rebellion, or economic failure. It often begins when those in charge lose sight of the higher purpose of power. Power is not to dominate, it is to protect, to preserve, to uplift. When strength is used to intimidate, it may win obedience, but it loses respect. When strength is used to silence, it may control others temporarily, but it corrupts the one who uses it. This is why wisdom must be the guide of strength. Because wisdom does not react, it responds. Wisdom does not strike, it studies. Wisdom does not seek to destroy, it seeks to understand what is truly worth defending. The strength of a nation is not only in its military, but in its values. When wisdom is absent, values are forgotten. Then the people lose trust, the system loses integrity, and even the most powerful infrastructure begins to erode. This is the slow collapse from within. It is not visible at first, but over time it weakens everything. On that near catastrophic day, both India and Pakistan were moments away from testing their strength in the most destructive way. But those who still remembered the weight of wisdom pulled the reins. They chose not to let power decide. They let clarity decide. Wisdom comes from reflection, from humility, from remembering that strength is temporary. Every empire, no matter how vast, has crumbled when it lost its center. That center is not made of steel or fire. It is made of purpose. Why do we fight? What are we defending? What will remain when the battle is over? If these questions are not asked, then even the strongest nation is only waiting to fall from arrogance, from exhaustion, or from the decay of its own principles. There is a danger in becoming too confident in one's strength. It creates blindness. The belief that we cannot be defeated is the first sign of inner weakness. Because that belief breeds carelessness. It removes the need for dialogue, for listening, for learning. A wise nation always remains alert, not just to the enemy outside, but to the enemy within. And the most dangerous internal enemy is the voice that says we are too strong to fail. History does not forgive that voice. On that crucial day, it was not the military advantage that mattered most. It was the decision to not let advantage turn into aggression. Strength does not give permission to be reckless. It demands more responsibility. The stronger you are, the more careful you must be, because your actions carry greater impact. One wrong move from the strong can destroy millions of the innocent. That is why wisdom is not optional. It is essential. Without it, strength is no longer a gift. It is a threat. The wisdom needed in moments of crisis is not gained in an instant. It must be cultivated over time. Through study, through discipline, through experience, leaders must train their minds, just as soldiers train their bodies. They must understand history not just to remember the past, but to avoid repeating its mistakes. The wisdom to hold back, to speak with calm, to choose de-escalation over domination. This is the true sign of strength. And it is this wisdom that prevented destruction that day. Collapse from within can also occur when a nation forgets the value of its own people, when it invests more in weapons than in education, more in division than in unity, more in control than in care. Wisdom reminds us that no amount of external power can protect a house whose foundation is cracking. The strength of a nation begins in the mind of every citizen. If those minds are filled with hate, with ignorance, with fear, then no wall is high enough to keep peace inside. But if those minds are trained in awareness, in compassion, in clarity, then peace becomes the natural state, not the forced one. Strength without wisdom may impress in the short term. It may even win battles, but it never builds peace. And in the end, peace is the only victory that matters. On that day, both India and Pakistan stood at the edge. Their strength had brought them there, but it was only wisdom that pulled them back. And that wisdom came not from systems, but from human beings. Those few who remember that power is not about winning. It is about knowing when not to fight. The inner collapse avoided that day was not only military, it was moral. It was a decision to keep integrity over impulse, to preserve life over proving might. And that decision was not loud. It did not make headlines. But it prevented history from turning into horror. That is the strength of wisdom. It works in silence, but its effect echoes for generations. In times to come, people may look back and wonder why that war did not happen. They may analyze data, discuss deterrence, count missiles, but the real answer lies in the unseen realm, in the minds that chose patience over pride, in the hearts that remembered what truly matters, and in the wisdom that reminded strength of its true purpose, not to conquer, but to protect, not to rise above others, but to rise within oneself. That is the power that does not collapse. That is the strength that endures. Silence is not the absence of sound, but the presence of understanding. In moments of great tension, when the world teeters on the edge of destruction, silence becomes the most powerful force. Not because it is empty, but because it holds everything that speech often cannot contain. On the day that Pakistan nearly destroyed India, it was not the speeches of politicians or the roars of fighter jets that decided the outcome. It was the quiet space between decisions, the momentary stillness in the hearts of those who held the fate of millions in their hands. That stillness did not come from hesitation, it came from mastery. And it was in that space of silent clarity that war was prevented. The mind, when untrained, seeks noise. It rushes to conclusions, shouts over doubt, and acts before thinking. But a trained mind learns to listen, not only to others, but to itself. It learns to hear the rise of emotion and the quiet voice of wisdom that follows. This kind of inner listening is only possible in silence. And silence is not weakness. It is strength that does not need to be seen. It is presence that does not demand attention. The loudest minds are not always the wisest. Sometimes it is the quiet mind that sees the clearest path. In the chaos of near war, silence became the rarest and most valuable resource. With every passing minute, pressure increased, advisors debated, generals stood ready, the chain of command waited for a single word, and yet the most important choice made was to wait, to not speak, to not act, to allow a moment of silence before unleashing irreversible consequences. That choice did not come from fear, it came from understanding. Understanding that sometimes the strongest statement is the one not made. If you pray, understanding sometimes only lay our hand, understanding that sometimes the strongest statement is the one not made. The greatest strike is the one withheld, the most powerful decision is the one guided not by urgency but by clarity. Silence is where perspective lives. In noise, the mind narrows. It becomes focused only on reaction, only on proving, defending, attacking. But in silence, the mind opens. It sees not just the enemy, but the human. Not just the threat, but the consequence. Silence is not inactivity. It is insight. It is where a leader can step out of the storm and ask the one question that matters most. What happens after? After the missile is launched, after the bomb falls, after the fire is unleashed. What remains? In silence, that question becomes loud. And once it is heard, it cannot be ignored. True silence is not the silence of ignorance. It is the silence of mastery. It is chosen, practiced. It is the silence that a warrior learns before the battle, not because he fears death, but because he respects life. It is the silence that a diplomat holds when provoked, not because he lacks words, but because he knows which words will destroy. It is the silence of the elder who has seen war and understands its cost. This silence is not passive, it is alive. And it was this silence that saved both nations from a path that would have led to ashes. It is the silence. In the hearts of soldiers on both sides there was noise. The noise of loyalty, the noise of duty, the noise of expectation. But some of them, those who had looked into the eyes of the enemy across a border not of their choosing, understood the truth that silence reveals. That the enemy is not always what we are told. That the other side is not a monster, but a mirror. And in silence, this reflection becomes clear. It shows us not just who the enemy is, but who we are when we choose to fight, and who we become when we choose not to. Leaders often feel the need to act, to respond, to show resolve, but not every moment demands action. Some moments demand stillness, not because the situation is simple, but because it is too complex to be rushed. Silence gives space for truth to emerge, for fear to settle, for wisdom to surface. In those crucial hours, the most powerful leaders were not those who shouted commands. They were the ones who dared to hold the silence, who allowed themselves to feel the weight of what a single decision could mean, who refused to be pushed by urgency and instead pulled by understanding. The world often praises speed, quick decisions, rapid responses, instant action. But there are moments when speed is the enemy, when action without reflection is the shortest path to ruin. In those moments, silence becomes the guardian of life. It holds the flame of reason in a windstorm of emotion. It allows time for the mind to return to center. And in that center, where stillness lives, the right decision can be found. Not the easiest, not the most popular, but the one aligned with truth. On that day, there were those who tried to break the silence, who demanded war, who shouted for vengeance, who called hesitation a betrayal. But the strongest minds did not listen to those voices. They listened to the silence within. And in that silence, they saw not just the battlefield, but the aftermath. Not just the maps, but the mothers. Not just the flags, but the funerals. And they chose not to add more names to the long list of those lost to pride. Silence also reveals responsibility. In noise, blame is easy. They started it. They crossed the line. We had no choice. But in silence, all of these excuses fall away. And what remains is the truth that every decision is a choice. That power is not given to avoid responsibility, but to accept it fully. In silence, a leader sees that his actions echo beyond his own country, beyond his own time. That every step taken in anger creates a wound in the world, and every step taken in silence with awareness creates space for healing. The most powerful moments in history are often not recorded. They are the decisions not made, the wars not started, the destruction not unleashed. And those moments begin in silence. Not the silence of fear, but the silence of presence. On the day that Pakistan nearly destroyed India, that silence was the invisible wall that held back chaos. It was built not by chance, but by the training of those who understood its value, who practiced it every day, in meditation, in reflection, in listening. And when the time came, they did not panic, they did not explode, they remained still. That stillness became the most powerful force in the region that day. More powerful than weapons, more enduring than threats. Because stillness carries with it the seed of peace. Not peace as a treaty or a compromise, but peace as a recognition that we are not enemies by nature, that we do not need to destroy to prove our strength, that the highest form of courage is not to fight, but to prevent the fight. The story of that day is not written in headlines, it is not told in parades or monuments. It is written in silence, in the breath between orders, in the hesitation that saved lives, in the quiet retreat from the edge of destruction. And in that silence lies the greatest lesson, that awareness is not loud, that true power is not always seen, and that peace, when it comes, arrives quietly through the hearts of those who have learned to listen